Ever wondered what a world looks like when an entire civilization just checks out? We often imagine the Roman Empire crumbling in a spectacular blaze, but in the province of Gaul, it was more like a slow, quiet fade, a grand theater where the actors had all gone home, leaving the stage lights flickering. This wasn't the heroic fall of a great empire, but the messy, chaotic birth of a new world, a land ripe for the taking by anyone with enough ambition and a big enough axe. And into that power vacuum stepped a people who would forever change the course of history, a collection of tribes with a very particular hairstyle and an insatiable appetite for land and glory. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, maybe post where you are and what time it is for you. Now, let's get into the quiet collapse of the old world and the loud arrival of the new. The story begins in the 5th century as the mighty Western Roman Empire, once a bedrock of stability and order, was slowly decomposing from the inside out. For generations, the vast lands of Gaul had been a shining jewel of the empire, a prosperous province with sprawling villas, bustling trade routes, and a sophisticated Gallo-Roman elite who spoke Latin and lived by Roman law. But the legions had been pulled back to defend Italy, leaving a power vacuum that was impossible to ignore. It was like a landlord who had stopped collecting rent but never moved out. The tenants just started doing whatever they wanted. Into this increasingly lawless landscape swarmed a number of Germanic tribes. The Visigoths settled in the southwest, the Burgundians in the southeast, but for our story, the most important were the Franks. They were a loose confederation of tribes living along the Rhine River, a group known for their brutal effectiveness in battle and their love of a good, sturdy helmet. The Romans had even, in a desperate move, hired some of them as foederati, or barbarian allies, to guard the borders against other barbarians. It's a classic fight fire with fire strategy, which, as you can probably guess, has a habit of getting out of control. Then came the man who would take this chaotic landscape and, through sheer force of will, forge a kingdom. We're talking about Clovis I, the king of the Salian Franks. He was not a humble man. He inherited a small, insignificant kingdom in what is now Belgium, but he had a vision that stretched far beyond his borders. His ambition was a quiet, cold, and calculated thing. His first big move was to take on the last remnant of Roman authority in Gaul, a guy named Syagrius, who had set himself up as a sort of rogue Roman governor. At the Battle of Soissons in 486, Clovis and his Frankish warriors decisively crushed Syagrius's forces. This victory was a massive statement, a clear signal that the old Roman order was officially dead and a new power was in town. It was after this battle that we get the famous story of the Vase of Soissons, a tale that perfectly illustrates Clovis's cunning and ruthlessness. After the battle, a bishop requested a beautiful special vase that had been looted from his church. Clovis wanted to return it to appease the powerful bishops, but a Frankish warrior, in a fit of pride and entitlement, smashed the vase with his axe, shouting that all spoils of war must be divided equally. Clovis, ever the pragmatist, did nothing at the time. He just let the moment pass. But a year later, during an inspection of his troops, he found a small fault in the warrior's gear, and in a fit of theatrical rage, split his skull with his own axe, shouting, "Thus you did at Soissons to the vase." It was a clear message to his men. Clovis was the boss, and his authority was absolute. It's a good reminder that back then, a bad day at the office could be a real head-splitter.
But Clovis's most significant move wasn't a battle. It was a baptism. Unlike most other Germanic rulers, who were Arian Christians, a rival, non-Trinitarian branch of Christianity, Clovis chose to convert to Nicene Catholicism. His wife, the Burgundian princess Clotilde, was a devout Catholic, and she had been encouraging his conversion for years. The story goes that during a particularly difficult battle against the Alemanni, Clovis was losing badly.
He prayed to the Christian God of his wife, promising to convert if he won the day. The tide of the battle turned, his army was victorious, and he kept his promise. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine spiritual epiphany or a calculated political move, but either way, the outcome was huge. His baptism and the baptism of his warriors gave him the instant support of the powerful Gallo-Roman bishops and their vast land holdings. It also positioned him as the legitimate successor to Rome in the eyes of the populace, not just another barbarian king. This was a masterstroke, a brilliant bit of statecraft that united his Frankish military might with the legitimacy of the Roman Church. He was now a Frankish king, ruling over a unified Frankish kingdom, and a Christian one at that. The dynasty he founded, the Merovingians, would rule for over 250 years, and their kings, with their long flowing hair, a symbol of their sacred power, would become the stuff of legend. Their legacy was the foundation of what would become France, a new kingdom that was a unique blend of Roman tradition, Christian faith, and Frankish law. This wasn't an empire like Charlemagne's. It was a rough and tumble kingdom with a lot of ambition and a serious political foundation. However, as the decades passed, the kings with their sacred long hair gradually lost their grip on power. The day-to-day work of running the kingdom was left to a new figure, the mayor of the palace, who was essentially the prime minister. These do-nothing kings were still kings in name, paraded around on ox carts, their long hair a symbol of a power they no longer truly held. This slow decline in royal authority paved the way for a new family to take control, a family that had been serving as mayors of the palace for generations, waiting for the perfect moment to step out of the shadows and onto the throne. The Merovingian kings, with their flowing hair and penchant for doing very little, had been a long-running joke, but the men who were doing the actual work were no laughing matter. These were the mayors of the palace, the king's chief ministers, who, over time, had quietly usurped all real power. They were the ones leading the armies, collecting the taxes, and running the kingdom, while the kings were, by many accounts, just sitting around a lot. One of the most famous of these powerful mayors was Charles Martel, the Hammer, and in 732 he lived up to his nickname. He led a Frankish army to a monumental victory against a massive Umayyad Muslim force at the Battle of Tours. This wasn't just a win, it was a game changer. It halted the Muslim expansion into Western Europe, saved Christendom from an existential threat, and cemented the reputation of the Carolingian family as the true power brokers in the land. The Merovingian king, at the time, was a distant footnote. Charles Martel was the man of the hour. Charles Martel's son, a man ironically named Pepin the Short, was even more ambitious than his father. He understood that while his family held the power, they still lacked the legitimacy of the royal title, so he devised a brilliant plan. He sent a message to the Pope, asking a very direct and loaded question. Is it right that a king with no power should rule a kingdom when another, who does all the work, is the real ruler? The Pope, who was in a bit of a political jam and needed a powerful military ally against the Lombards in Italy, agreed with Pepin's logic. So, in 751, the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, had his sacred long hair cut off, a truly devastating insult in that culture, and was packed off to a monastery. Pepin the Short was then anointed king by a representative of the Pope, officially starting the Carolingian dynasty. This was a revolutionary act, a new precedent that a king's authority came not just from inheritance, but from the divine grace of the church itself. Pepin the Short's son, though, was the one who would take this new dynasty to unbelievable heights. We know him as Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. He was a force of nature, a towering figure with a booming voice and a boundless energy that made him impossible to ignore. He was a brilliant military strategist and a man with a vision far grander than anyone before him, a vision of a unified Christian empire. He spent the majority of his reign, from 768 to 814, on the march, leading his armies on a relentless series of military campaigns. He conquered the Lombards in Italy, crushed the Saxons in the east, and forced their conversion to Christianity at sword point, which you know is one way to get people to church, and pushed his borders deep into modern-day Spain. By the end of his reign, he controlled a territory so vast it stretched from the Pyrenees to the North Sea, and from the Atlantic to Central Europe. The guy basically created the blueprint for what would eventually become both France and Germany. A real 2-for-1 deal for the price of one emperor. But Charlemagne wasn't just a conqueror. He was a builder. He understood that to run a vast empire, you needed smart people, a common language, and a consistent system of laws. So, he made his court at Aachen the center of a cultural and intellectual revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. He, a man who was reportedly still learning to read, surrounded himself with scholars from all over Europe, bringing in brilliant minds like Alcuin of York to lead the palace school. They worked to standardize a new script, Carolingian minuscule, which made reading and writing much easier and more uniform than the messy, barely legible scripts that came before. Seriously, before this, manuscripts looked like a chicken had a fight with a pen. He also standardized weights, measures, and even coinage. He was a kind of ancient CEO who understood that you needed more than just a big army to make an empire last. You needed a functioning bureaucracy and a literate administration. Then came the big day. On Christmas Day 800, while Charlemagne was kneeling in prayer at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a crown on his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. This was a monumental moment. It was meant to symbolize the restoration of the Western Roman Empire, a claim to be the spiritual successor of the Caesars. Historians still argue whether Charlemagne was genuinely surprised by the coronation or if it was a carefully orchestrated power play, but either way, the message was clear. There was now a new emperor in the West, and he was a Frank. This event tied the church and the new empire together in an intricate web of mutual support and, as we'll see later, a whole lot of conflict. For the French, this was a massive deal. Charlemagne is seen as a founder of their nation, a hero whose legend would grow with every passing century. The Chanson de Roland, a famous epic poem, tells of his valiant struggle against the Muslims in Spain, and his name is still synonymous with a glorious, if a little romanticized, past. His immense charisma and personal will held the empire together, but without him, it was a fragile structure, a fact that his successors would soon discover. The magnificent, sprawling empire of Charlemagne, which had been forged by one man's immense will and boundless energy, was, as we hinted at, a fragile thing. It was a bit like a huge, intricate sculpture, held together by a single powerful magnet. Once that magnet, Charlemagne, was gone, the whole thing was destined to fall apart. His son, Louis the Pious, inherited the entire realm. He was a good man, pious and well-meaning, but he was no Charlemagne.
He was more interested in monastic reform than military conquest, a man better suited for the cloister than the throne of a vast, unruly empire. And his primary problem wasn't a foreign enemy, but a domestic one. His own three ambitious sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald. This wasn't a little spat over who got the better bedroom. It was a full-blown, multi-decade civil war, with armies clashing and alliances constantly shifting.
The poor guy was caught in the middle of it all, trying to manage his squabbling offspring while watching his father's carefully constructed empire slowly tear itself apart. The climax of this dynastic drama came in 841 at the Battle of Fontenoy, where the two younger brothers, Louis and Charles, united their forces against the eldest, Lothair. It was a massive and bloody battle, a true tragedy where Frankish armies fought against fellow Franks, and it was a clear signal that the idea of a unified empire was officially over. After this devastating clash, the three brothers, exhausted and with their resources depleted, were finally ready to talk peace.
This led to a very interesting and telling moment a year later at the Oaths of Strasbourg. Louis the German and Charles the Bald met to publicly swear an oath of mutual support against Lothair. But here's the fascinating part. They swore the oaths in each other's language. Louis swore in a Romance dialect that was a kind of Proto-French, and Charles swore in a Germanic language. This was a hugely symbolic moment, a clear indication that the empire had already fractured not just politically, but linguistically and culturally. It was the first time we see these two separate linguistic identities, the seeds of French and German, being so publicly acknowledged. The negotiations finally culminated in the year 843 with the signing of the Treaty of Verdun. This was the official moment, the legal document that formalized the division of the Carolingian Empire. The empire was split into three distinct kingdoms, each with its own ruler. Lothair, as the eldest, was granted the Middle Kingdom, a long snaking strip of land that stretched from the North Sea to Italy.
This Middle Francia was a geopolitical nightmare, a long, skinny territory with no natural borders, and it would quickly dissolve into a patchwork of smaller states. He also got to keep the imperial title, which by this point was mostly a ceremonial role. Louis the German received the eastern part, which would eventually become the Kingdom of Germany. And finally, Charles the Bald was given the western portion, the territory that would become known as West Francia. This is where our story of France really takes shape. While Lothair's Middle Kingdom evaporated and Louis the German's territory went on its own path, West Francia was the direct precursor to the modern French state.
The Treaty of Verdun essentially drew the first rough borders of France. The language spoken in West Francia was a version of Romance, a sort of Proto-French, which was distinct from the Germanic languages spoken in the Eastern Kingdom. The treaty, therefore, not only divided land, but also began to solidify separate cultural and linguistic identities. It was a momentous and, in a way, tragic event.
Charlemagne's legacy of a unified, powerful empire was gone, replaced by three weaker, squabbling kingdoms. It was like a huge, grand mansion being split into three separate, slightly leaky apartments, a real estate decision that everyone would regret for centuries. The new kingdom of West Francia was not a picture of stability. Charles the Bald had his hands full. The kingdom was constantly under threat from within and without. The great nobles, counts, and dukes who had been appointed by Charlemagne and his successors, were increasingly acting as independent rulers. They built their own castles, raised their own armies, and started passing their titles down to their sons, turning their administrative roles into hereditary fiefdoms.
The central authority of the king was waning, and the feudal system, which had been developing for some time, was now rapidly accelerating. This was a massive shift in power, moving it away from a strong central monarch to a decentralized system where local lords held the real power. It was a massive crisis of authority, a problem the early French kings would spend centuries trying to fix.
To make matters worse, a new and terrifying threat was emerging from the sea. The Viking raids, as we'll get to in the next section, were beginning to plague the coasts and rivers of West Francia. The decentralized nature of the kingdom meant that the king couldn't effectively defend his vast coastline, leaving the local lords to deal with the raiders on their own. This in turn gave the lords even more power and influence, as they were the ones protecting their people.
It was a vicious cycle of a king losing power because he couldn't protect his people, and the lords gaining power because they could. The Carolingian dynasty in West Francia was struggling, and its hold on the throne was growing weaker with each passing year. The name Francia itself was a reminder of the Carolingian heritage, but the reality on the ground was a kingdom in transition, a land in the process of becoming something entirely new, a medieval state shaped by the forces of decentralization, external threat, and internal power struggles. It was a messy, difficult birth, but a necessary one for the kingdom we know as France.
The Treaty of Verdun, which had carved Charlemagne's empire into 3 separate kingdoms, had created a political entity in West Francia that was, to put it mildly, a bit of a fixer-upper. The king's authority was fragile, and the great lords were already acting like independent rulers. It was a kingdom just waiting for a new external threat to expose all its weaknesses, and that threat came from the sea. The Vikings, or as the Franks called them, the Northmen, were a new and terrifying force, not just raiders, but explorers, traders, and settlers who would plague Western Europe for the better part of 2 centuries. Imagine waking up to the sound of horns and war cries, watching long, slender ships with dragon heads carved into their prows glide effortlessly up your river. These shallow draft vessels, known as longships, were a marvel of shipbuilding, and they meant that no town, no matter how far inland, was truly safe. From the 9th century onward, the Vikings made a habit of sailing up the Seine, the Loire, and the Garonne rivers, bringing terror and destruction with them. They'd sack monasteries, plunder towns, and demand hefty ransoms, known as Danegeld, just to leave. The Frankish kings, the descendants of Charlemagne, were largely powerless to stop them. The decentralized nature of the kingdom was a huge liability. The king couldn't be everywhere at once, and the local counts and dukes were often more concerned with defending their own lands than with a unified response. This created a vicious cycle where the Vikings would raid, the local lords would have to raise their own armies to defend their people, and in doing so, their power and prestige would grow, further eroding the king's authority. One of the most famous examples of this struggle was the Siege of Paris in 885. A massive Viking fleet, some accounts say as many as 700 ships, sailed up the Seine and laid siege to the city for months. The city's defense was led not by the king, but by a local count named Odo and the Bishop of Paris. They held out valiantly, and the siege became a symbol of Frankish resistance. But the king, Charles the Fat, a very unfortunate nickname for a man who was proving to be a political lightweight, only showed up after months of fighting and offered the Vikings a bribe of 700 pounds of silver to leave and permission to go raid further up the river. This move was a massive failure of royal leadership and a huge insult to the defenders of Paris.
It was the kind of political decision that makes people start looking around for a new boss.
The constant Viking threat had a lasting impact on West Francia. It further solidified the power of local lords who had to build fortified castles and raise armies to protect their lands. The king's authority, already weakened by the Treaty of Verdun and the internal bickering, was now even more diminished. People looked to their local count or duke for protection, not to a distant king who was often unable to help. This decentralization would become the defining feature of the next few centuries. But the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were also settlers. The raids gradually morphed into a desire for land. They saw the fertile lands of what would become Normandy, a name that literally means land of the Northmen, as a prime spot to set up shop. The Frankish king, Charles the Simple, looking for a way to stop the raids once and for all, decided to try a different approach. In 911, he signed the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte with a Viking chieftain named Rollo. The deal was a hugely pragmatic one. Rollo and his men would stop raiding and would convert to Christianity. In exchange, Charles would give him a large piece of land around the city of Rouen, which would become the Duchy of Normandy. The Vikings would become vassals of the king and, in a brilliant bit of statecraft, would act as a buffer, defending the kingdom against other Viking raiders. It was a classic set a thief to catch a thief strategy, and it worked. Rollo and his descendants quickly adopted the local customs and language, becoming the Normans. They were still Vikings in spirit, a fierce warrior class, but they were now also part of the French feudal system. This integration of the Vikings into the Frankish power structure was a crucial moment in the history of France. The Normans, as they would come to be known, became some of the most powerful and influential nobles in the kingdom. Their presence, however, would also lead to some interesting and complicated situations down the line. Most famously, a descendant of this Viking chieftain, William the Conqueror, would go on to lead an army on a little trip across the English Channel in 1066, a conquest that would forever link the fates of England and France. It's a prime example of how interconnected and often convoluted medieval history could be. The Carolingian dynasty, which had started with the grand vision of Charlemagne, was slowly running out of steam. The last of the Carolingian kings in West Francia was a bit of a political punching bag, and the great nobles, particularly the powerful counts of Paris, were now the ones calling the shots. The stage was set for a new family to take the throne, a family whose rise was a direct consequence of the chaos and instability of the Viking Age. A new era was about to begin, an era defined not by a grand empire, but by a long, slow, and often messy struggle for centralized power. The Carolingian dynasty, which had started with the grand vision of Charlemagne, was, by the late 10th century, a spent force in West Francia. The constant Viking raids, coupled with the growing independence of powerful local nobles, had left the king's authority in tatters. The last Carolingian kings were essentially puppets, their power confined to a small area around their court. Real power had shifted to the great counts and dukes, who were now the true rulers of their domains. Among these powerful families, one stood out, the Counts of Paris. This family, the Robertinians, had earned their prestige and power by being the ones who actually defended the realm during the worst of the Viking onslaughts, most notably during the heroic siege of Paris in 885. This made them heroes in the eyes of the people, and a serious political force, a family with a clear track record of competence, a stark contrast to the Carolingian line. The situation came to a head in 987, after the death of the last Carolingian king, Louis V, who died young and without an heir. For a dynasty that had struggled for so long to establish a stable succession, this was a final, embarrassing failure. The nobles gathered to elect a new king. While there was a distant Carolingian claimant, the most powerful man in the kingdom was Hugh Capet, the Count of Paris.
His family had been a thorn in the side of the Carolingian kings for years, and he was the one with the military strength and political savvy to actually command respect. He was, to put it mildly, the most obvious choice. A skilled diplomat and a canny politician, Hugh Capet was elected king by the great magnates of the kingdom. With this single act, the Capetian dynasty began, a line of kings that would rule France, in one form or another, for over 800 years.
It was a quiet, undramatic revolution that replaced a crumbling, ineffective monarchy with a new, ambitious one. The Capetian kings were different from the start. They didn't claim to be the spiritual successors of Roman emperors like Charlemagne had. Their power base was much smaller and more realistic. The Capetian royal domain, the land directly controlled by the king, was initially just a small strip of territory around Paris and Orléans.
The rest of the kingdom was a patchwork of powerful duchies and counties, like Normandy, Brittany, Aquitaine, Flanders, and Burgundy, each ruled by a powerful lord who was, in theory, the king's vassal, but in practice was often his equal or even his superior. The early Capetians understood this reality perfectly. They knew they couldn't just conquer their powerful neighbors, so they relied on a strategy of shrewd politics, strategic marriages, and most importantly, the legitimacy provided by the church.
Hugh Capet's greatest move was his most subtle, and it was all about succession. For the last 200 years, the French throne had been an elective position, a messy affair that often led to civil war and instability. Hugh Capet put a stop to that. He had his son, Robert, crowned and anointed as co-ruler while he was still alive. This practice of association continued for a century, with each Capetian king crowning his eldest son as co-ruler.
It was a brilliant, almost imperceptible way to establish the principle of hereditary succession, bypassing the need for a potentially messy royal election every time a king died. It was a crucial innovation that gave the French crown a stability it had not seen since before the Treaty of Verdun. This was the true genius of the early Capetians. They were more interested in long-term dynastic security than in short-term military glory, a decision that would pay off for centuries to come.
The early Capetian kings, often called the kings of France, were not yet the absolute monarchs of later centuries. They were more like the CEOs of a very unruly company, with all the regional managers doing their own thing. Their true power was not in their military might, which was often outmatched by their vassals, but in their symbolic role as the anointed king. They were seen as God's chosen representative on earth, and their touch was even believed to have the power to heal certain diseases. This sacred aura gave them a moral authority that their vassals lacked. They also used their position to act as arbitrators in disputes between nobles and to expand their small royal domain through a mix of cunning diplomacy and, when the opportunity arose, military force. Historians still debate whether this was the birth of the French nation-state or just the final, decisive nail in the coffin of the Carolingian Empire. The rise of the Capetians marked the true beginning of the French nation. The kingdom of West Francia, a shadow of Charlemagne's empire, was now starting its long, slow journey toward becoming a centralized state. The story of the next several centuries would be the story of the Capetians and their struggle to transform their symbolic power into real, tangible authority. They had started with little more than a name and a small piece of land. But they had one thing the Carolingians had lost: a stable succession and a long-term vision. This allowed them to outlast and outmaneuver their rivals, laying the groundwork for the powerful kingdom that would eventually emerge. It was a slow burn, but a powerful one, and the foundations for the modern French state were being laid, one strategic marriage and one successful succession at a time. The era of the do-nothing kings was officially over. A new era of do-it-all kings was about to begin. With the Capetians on the throne, the stage was set for the high point of the feudal system. This wasn't a sudden, top-down structure, but a messy, organic arrangement that had evolved over centuries, a direct response to the chaos and insecurity of the post-Carolingian world. At the top was the king, but his authority was often more symbolic than real. Real power resided with the great lords, the dukes, counts, and barons, who controlled vast swathes of land. This was a world built on oaths of fealty and personal relationships. A lord would grant a piece of land, a fief, to a vassal in exchange for military service and loyalty. This created a complex pyramid of allegiances, with the king at the top, but many layers of lords and vassals below him, each with their own sub-vassals. It was a bit like a medieval multi-level marketing scheme, but with swords instead of essential oils. This system, though decentralized, was surprisingly effective at a local level. The lords, with their fortified castles, provided protection to the peasants and knights on their land. In return, the peasants or serfs were tied to the land and had to work for their lord, giving him a portion of their crops and labor. It was a harsh life, but it offered a degree of security in a dangerous world. The knights, the military class, were at the heart of this system. They were professional warriors, living by a code of chivalry that, while often more of an ideal than a reality, shaped their behavior and their role in society. They were the muscle of the feudal system, the ones who enforced the lord's will and fought his battles. This was a society where your place was determined by birth, and your primary duty was to your immediate lord. The power of the lords, however, had its downsides. It meant constant small-scale warfare. Nobles were frequently feuding with each other over land, titles, and honor. This internal strife, what some historians call the feudal revolution, meant that while the Kingdom of France was a theoretical entity, it was really a collection of powerful, self-governing fiefdoms, often at war with each other. The early Capetian kings, with their small royal domain, were often just another powerful lord, struggling to hold their own against rivals like the Dukes of Normandy or the Counts of Blois. They had a huge advantage, though. Their sacred status and the principle of hereditary succession gave them a legitimacy that no other noble had. While a Duke of Normandy might be more powerful in terms of land and armies, he was still technically the king's vassal, and this was a fact that the Capetians would exploit over the centuries. The Church, a powerful force in its own right, tried to bring some order to this chaos. The constant feuding was terrible for business, and even worse, for the soul. They created the peace of God and the truce of God, which were attempts to curb noble violence. The peace of God protected non-combatants like clergy, pilgrims, merchants, and peasants. The truce of God restricted fighting to certain days of the week, often from Thursday evening to Monday morning, or during holy seasons like Lent. These weren't always effective,
but they were a clear sign that the church was acting as a major social and political force, trying to bring a little bit of calm to a very turbulent world.
Then, at the end of the 11th century, came a new unifying force to a feudal Europe that was, in many ways, just learning to walk: the Crusades. The Pope, Urban II, a French native, called for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from the Seljuk Turks in 1095 at the Council of Clermont, and the response from the French nobles was overwhelming. The First Crusade, in particular, was a heavily French affair. French knights, nobles, and commoners made up the bulk of the armies that marched east. This was a massive undertaking, and it had a profound impact on France. It provided a powerful, shared purpose for a fractious nobility, diverting their violent tendencies away from each other and towards a common enemy. It also created new opportunities for wealth and prestige, and many nobles sold or mortgaged their lands to finance their expensive journey, a financial strain that often worked to the benefit of the king, who was keen to acquire new lands for the royal domain.
Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for these crusaders was genuine piety, a desire to protect pilgrims and liberate the Holy Land, or a more worldly one, driven by a lust for land, wealth, and adventure. It was likely a bit of both, a messy mix of religious fervor and feudal ambition, which is a very medieval combination. The Crusades also brought France into contact with the sophisticated cultures of the Byzantine and Muslim worlds. They brought back new goods, new ideas, and a wider worldview. This was a period of cultural and intellectual awakening, a stepping stone to the later Renaissance. The Crusades, therefore, were a mixed bag for France. They were a religious and military disaster in many ways, but they also helped to channel noble aggression, stimulate the economy, and give the Capetian kings an opportunity to consolidate their power at home while their most unruly vassals were off fighting in the Holy Land.
The next few centuries would be the story of how the Capetians, starting from this position of relative weakness, would systematically use every tool at their disposal, marriages, diplomacy, and war, to turn their feudal kingdom into a powerful, centralized monarchy. The Capetian dynasty, remember, had done the hard work of establishing a hereditary line, but they were still, for the most part, a monarchy on paper. The reality on the ground was a patchwork of powerful, unruly fiefdoms, and the king was often just another powerful lord, struggling to hold his own. The royal domain, the Ile-de-France, was a chaotic and dangerous place, riddled with fortified castles belonging to barons who saw the king as little more than a distant figurehead. These lords were, to put it mildly, a constant headache. They built their castles on strategic roads, extorted tolls from merchants and travelers, and waged petty wars on each other, a constant drain on the kingdom's stability and a huge embarrassment to the king. A monarch who can't even control the roads leading to his own capital isn't much of a monarch at all. Then came a king who, though lacking in personal glamour, was a brilliant pragmatist. This was Louis XVI, nicknamed the Fat for his sedentary lifestyle and, well, his size. He was not a chivalric hero, he was a methodical problem solver. He understood that to be a king of France, he first had to be the master of his own house. His reign was all about one thing: the long, grinding process of centralizing power in and around his royal domain. He spent the better part of his reign, from 1108 to 1137, systematically subduing these local lords. He would besiege their castles, destroy their fortifications, and bring them to heel. The battles were often difficult and messy. He famously fought against the lords of Montlhéry, who controlled a castle so close to Paris that it was a constant threat to the king. He was a king who was constantly on the move,
leading his own armies and personally overseeing the subjugation of these rebellious nobles. His actions were a watershed moment. For the first time, a French king was acting as a real authority, not just a ceremonial figurehead. He wasn't a king who was content to be a landlord with a fancy title. He wanted to be the real deal. He also worked closely with the church, particularly with his friend and chief advisor, Abbot Suger of Saint Denis. Suger was not only a religious leader, but a cunning politician and a key architect of Capetian policy. He helped to legitimize Louis VI's actions, framing the king's battles against the rebellious barons not just as a struggle for power, but as a fight for law and order, a fight for the peace of the king.
Louis VI and Suger understood that the king's legitimacy came from his role as the protector of his people. By providing security, they were earning the loyalty of the common people and the support of the church, two powerful allies in their struggle against the nobility. It was a clear shift from the old feudal idea of a king who was just primus inter pares, first among equals, to a king who was a genuine sovereign, a bringer of peace and justice. Historians still argue whether his actions were a genuine quest for justice or a ruthless power grab, but either way, the outcome was the same. Louis VI's policies were a success. He may not have added vast territories to the French kingdom, but he did something much more important. He gave the French monarchy a backbone. He turned the king's domain from a chaotic collection of unruly fiefs into a unified, secure heartland.
This stability would become the launching pad for his successors to start the long, slow, and often bloody process of expanding their power and territory. One of the lesser-known but fascinating aspects of Louis VI's reign was his relationship with the rising towns and cities. The urban centers, with their growing merchant classes, were seeking more independence from their feudal lords.
Louis VI, recognizing an opportunity, often granted these towns charters of liberty, giving them a degree of self-government in exchange for their loyalty and taxes. This was a brilliant move. He was creating a new power base for the monarchy, one that was not tied to the old feudal nobility. It was a bit like finding a new best friend who has a lot of money and a real knack for bureaucracy. He was, in effect, playing the old guard against the new, and in doing so, strengthening his own hand. He also had a long-standing rivalry with King Henry VI of England, who was also the Duke of Normandy. The two were constantly at odds over the border regions and influence in the French court. This rivalry was a harbinger of the much larger conflicts to come. Louis VI held his own against the more powerful Norman king, a testament to his own military and political competence. He was an incredibly forward-thinking monarch whose seemingly small local battles were, in fact, laying the groundwork for a centralized, powerful French state. The era of the do-nothing kings was officially over, and a new era of proactive, if a little rotund, monarchs was beginning. His son, Louis XVII, would continue this struggle and, as we'll see, would make a strategic marriage that would almost lead to disaster. Louis VI, the Fat, had done a solid job consolidating his small domain, but his son and successor, Louis VII, was a very different kind of king. He was a pious and serious man, more comfortable in a monastery than on a battlefield, a ruler who took his religious obligations to an extreme. And his marriage in 1137 would set off a chain of events that would change the course of European history for centuries to come. His bride was no ordinary noblewoman. She was Eleanor of Aquitaine, the spirited and fiercely intelligent heiress to the vast and wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine. Her lands in the southwest of France were far larger and richer than the king's own royal domain. This marriage was a monumental win for the Capetians, instantly doubling the size of their kingdom and giving them control over a key region. It was a political masterpiece, or so they thought. The problem was that Louis and Eleanor were, to put it mildly, a terrible match. He was a devout ascetic. She was a vivacious and worldly woman, a patron of courtly love and the arts, and from a culture that was much more free-spirited. Their personalities clashed spectacularly, and their marriage was a source of constant tension. Eleanor even went on the disastrous Second Crusade with Louis, an event that did nothing to improve their relationship.
To make matters worse, the marriage produced 2 daughters but no male heir, which was a huge problem for a dynasty that had just, with great effort, established the principle of hereditary succession. After years of bickering, mutual accusations of infidelity, and a lot of political maneuvering, Louis VII had the marriage annulled in 1152.
The stated reason was consanguinity, or being too closely related, a very convenient excuse that was often used back then to get out of an inconvenient marriage. The annulment was a massive political blunder, one of the biggest in French history. Eleanor was now a free woman, still the heiress to Aquitaine, and a powerful prize for any noble. Just 2 months later, in a move that must have sent shock waves through the French court, she married Henry Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy. Henry, who was younger than Eleanor and known for his boundless energy, would become King Henry II of England 2 years later. Suddenly, through this one marriage, a rival monarch now controlled not only England but also Normandy, Anjou, and thanks to his new wife, the massive Duchy of Aquitaine. The English king's lands in France were now far larger and richer than the French king's. This new geopolitical entity was a juggernaut known as the Angevin Empire, and it essentially surrounded the small royal domain of the Capetians. It was a bit like a tiny ice cream shop suddenly finding itself surrounded on all sides by a giant angry Baskin-Robbins that had just acquired a new, incredibly popular flavor. Eleanor's role in this was pivotal. She wasn't just a trophy wife. She was a major political player in her own right. She ruled Aquitaine with a firm hand and was a central figure in the politics of both England and France. She was the mother of 2 English kings and a true power broker, a woman who controlled more land than the King of France himself. She often sided with her sons, Richard and John, against her husband, Henry II, and was even imprisoned by him for a time for her part in a rebellion. Her story is a perfect example of how women, though often relegated to the shadows in historical narratives, could wield immense power through their lands and their lineage. Her court at Poitiers was a center of culture and courtly love, and she was a patron of troubadours and poets, an entirely different world from the pious court of her first husband. Historians still argue whether her political actions were driven by a genuine love of power or by a desire to protect her lands from a series of male rulers she saw as unfit to govern. Louis VII spent the rest of his long reign dealing with the consequences of his divorce. He was now in a constant low-level conflict with Henry II and the Angevin Empire. The French kings, who had spent decades consolidating their power, were now faced with a rival so powerful he was, in many ways, the real king of France. The next few decades would be a struggle for survival for the Capetians. They were fighting for their very existence against a more powerful neighbor, and their strategy would have to be one of cunning, patience, and exploiting every weakness in their opponent's armor. The conflict between the French and English crowns, which would last for centuries and culminate in the 100 Years' War, had its roots right here, in the marriage and subsequent divorce of Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine. It was a soap opera of epic proportions, with the fate of nations hanging in the balance, and it gave the French monarchy a clear, tangible enemy to define itself against. The slow, patient work of Louis VI would now be tested in a fire forged by a single catastrophic divorce. The catastrophic divorce of Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Remember that? It had created a political monster, the Angevin Empire, an English-controlled territory in France that was far larger and more powerful than the French king's own domain. The Capetian monarchy was now in a fight for its very survival, and it would be up to a new kind of king to take on this impossible task. That king was Philip II, later nicknamed Augustus, a name meaning the Great or the Venerable, a moniker he would certainly live up to. He was a cold, calculating, and exceptionally shrewd monarch who came to the throne in 1180. He was a master of diplomacy, a capable military commander, and most importantly, he had a single-minded goal: to dismantle the Angevin Empire and expand the French royal domain. Philip understood that the Angevin Empire, for all its vastness, was a fragile personal union held together by the charisma of one man, Henry II, and his equally ambitious sons. He began a long, patient campaign of attrition, playing Henry II's sons, Richard the Lionheart and John, against their father and against each other. It was a strategy of sowing discord and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. A game of medieval chess played with real kingdoms and real armies.
The moment came after the death of Henry II and the ascension of his formidable son, Richard the Lionheart. While Richard was a military genius and a crusading hero, he was a neglectful ruler of his French possessions, spending most of his reign outside of them, either on the Third Crusade or fighting elsewhere. He was a great warrior, but a bad king in the administrative sense, and his long absences gave Philip II the perfect opportunity.
Philip, a man who preferred politics to personal combat, saw Richard as an obstacle to be outmaneuvered, not a rival to be defeated in open battle. When Richard was captured on his way back from the crusade, Philip II worked hard to extend his imprisonment and even offered a bribe to keep him locked up. It was a dirty trick, but in the brutal world of medieval politics, anything was fair game.
He eventually failed to keep Richard locked up, and the two would spend the next few years in a bitter, low-level conflict until Richard's untimely death in 1199. The true turning point, however, came with Richard's death and the ascension of his younger brother, King John. John was, to put it mildly, not his brother. He was a poor general, a bad diplomat, and had a nasty reputation, which is saying a lot for that era. He was famously known as John Lackland because he had inherited so little from his father. Philip II saw his opportunity and went for the jugular. When John was accused of murdering his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, a rival claimant to the throne, Philip II, who was the overlord of the French territories, summoned John to the French court to answer for the crime. When John predictably refused to show up, Philip II used this legal pretext to declare all of John's French fiefs to be forfeited. This was a massive, if technically legal claim, and it set the stage for war.
Philip II systematically invaded and conquered John's French territories. He captured Normandy in 1204, a massive prize that had been in the hands of the English crown for over a century and a half. One by one, the other Angevin territories fell: Anjou, Maine, and Poitou. The Angevin Empire, which had once threatened to consume the French monarchy, was now reduced to a few scattered territories in the southwest. The guy lost so much land, you'd think he'd left it in a medieval Uber. The culmination of Philip II's reign came at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. This was a monumental battle, a rare pitched battle in an era of sieges and skirmishes. Philip II's French army faced a massive coalition of forces led by King John Emperor Otto IV of the Holy Roman Empire, and other French nobles who opposed the king. Philip won a decisive, crushing victory. The victory was a huge propaganda coup, legitimizing the Capetian dynasty as the true rulers of France and proving the king's military and political superiority over his rivals. It was a watershed moment. Before Bouvines, the French king was just one of many powerful lords. After Bouvines, he was unquestionably the most powerful man in the kingdom. He was no longer just the Count of Paris. He was truly the King of France. Historians still argue whether this was the first moment of true French national identity, a feeling of fighting for France itself, rather than just for a feudal lord. Philip II's reign was a masterclass in nation-building. He didn't just conquer lands, he also established a centralized bureaucracy to govern them. He created a new class of royal officials, the bailli and seneschaux, who administered justice and collected taxes in the newly acquired territories, replacing the old feudal system with a more direct form of royal governance.
He also fortified Paris, building the Louvre fortress and paving the city streets, turning his capital into a true center of royal power. By the time of his death, he had transformed the Kingdom of France from a fragmented feudal state into a powerful centralized monarchy, one that was finally ready to start acting like a unified nation. The stage was set for his successors to continue the work he had so brilliantly begun.
Philip II Augustus, remember, had done a spectacular job of consolidating power in the north, but the south of France was a different world entirely. This wasn't a feudal patchwork of warring lords, but a vibrant, culturally distinct region known as Languedoc, a land of troubadours, poets, and a relative religious tolerance that was almost unheard of in the rest of Europe.
But beneath this cultural flowering, a different kind of belief was taking root, a religious movement that was a direct challenge to the authority of the Catholic Church. This was the heresy of the Cathars, or Albigensians, who were particularly strong in the region. They were a fascinating group, believing in a dualistic system where the spiritual world was created by a good God and the material world was created by an evil God.
They lived ascetic lives, rejected the Catholic Church's authority, and had their own clergy, known as the Parfaits, or perfect ones. To the Church in Rome, they were a dangerous and unacceptable threat.
The Church, under the powerful and determined Pope Innocent III, had tried to use peaceful means to bring the Cathars back into the fold, sending preachers and papal legates to the region. But his efforts failed, and the Pope's patience was wearing thin. The breaking point came in 1208 with the murder of a papal legate, a man named Pierre de Castelnau, for which the powerful Count of Toulouse, Raymond VI, was blamed. The murder gave the Pope the pretext he needed. He declared a crusade against the Cathars and all who supported them. This wasn't a crusade to a far-off land like Jerusalem. This was a war on home soil, a call for French knights to fight against fellow Frenchmen. The response from the nobles of northern France was immediate and overwhelming. They saw this as a chance not only to win spiritual absolution, but also, just as importantly, to seize the rich and prosperous lands of the south. This was the medieval version of a religious war being a great excuse for a very aggressive real estate acquisition.
The war that followed was brutal. The southern region of Languedoc, with its unique culture, was plunged into a period of unimaginable violence. The crusade was led by the ruthless and effective northern commander, Simon de Montfort, a man who was as pious as he was brutal. The crusade began in 1209 with the massacre at Béziers, an event that has come to symbolize the horrifying nature of the war. The Crusaders besieged the city, and when it fell, they were faced with a problem: how to tell the heretics from the Catholics. A papal legate was reportedly asked this question, and gave the now infamous reply, "Kill them all. God will know his own." They proceeded to slaughter thousands of people, Catholics and Cathars alike, a shocking act that set the tone for the rest of the war. The conflict was a long, drawn-out affair, a mix of pitched battles, long sieges, and political intrigue. Simon de Montfort was a military genius, and he won a series of victories that brought him close to total control of the region. But the Southerners resisted fiercely, not wanting to lose their independence to the northern French lords. The French royal family initially stayed on the sidelines, content to let their northern vassals do the dirty work. King Philip II was too busy consolidating his power in the north after the Battle of Bouvines to get directly involved. He saw the crusade as a useful tool to weaken his rivals and, as it turned out, to eventually absorb the territory. When Simon de Montfort was killed in 1218, the war became a messy stalemate. It was at this point that Philip II's son, Louis VIII, stepped in. He led a royal army into the region, and after his short reign, his son Louis IX would finalize the process. The French crown, seeing an opportunity to finally bring the wealthy and culturally distinct South under their control, launched their own official military campaigns. The local lords of the South, their power broken by decades of constant warfare, had no choice but to submit to the king.
The outcome of the Albigensian Crusade was a massive expansion of the French royal domain. The Treaty of Paris in 1229 officially ended the war and brought the county of Toulouse under the control of the French crown. The Crusade, which had started as a religious conflict, had morphed into a war of conquest. The legacy of the Crusade was complex. On one hand, it brutally suppressed a religious heresy and destroyed a unique regional culture.
On the other, it was a pivotal moment in the formation of France as a unified nation, bringing the culturally and linguistically distinct South into the royal fold. The work started by Philip II in the north was now being completed in the south. Historians still argue whether the crusade was a genuine religious campaign to root out heresy or a cynical, politically motivated land grab by the northern French nobility and the crown. Either way, the Kingdom of France was beginning to look much more like the nation we know today. The monarchy was growing, not just in territory, but in power and authority, setting the stage for the reign of one of France's most famous and beloved kings. The Albigensian Crusade had left France larger and more unified, but it had also left a moral and spiritual scar. The kingdom, now a powerful player in Europe, needed a new kind of leader, a king who could consolidate these gains and give the monarchy a new moral authority. That king was Louis IX, a man so devoted to his faith and justice that he would later be canonized as St. Louis. He came to the throne as a young boy in 1226, with his mother, Blanche of Castile, acting as a brilliant and fiercely protective regent. Blanche was not just a placeholder, she was a political force of nature, a shrewd and determined queen who skillfully managed the kingdom, putting down a series of noble revolts and ensuring her son inherited a stable, well-run country.
This was a crucial period. Without Blanche's strong leadership, the Capetian gains of the previous century could have easily been undone.
Louis IX, once he came of age, was unlike many of the ambitious, land-hungry monarchs of his time. He was a deeply pious man, a devout Christian who attended Mass twice a day, and was known for his personal austerity. He saw his role as king not just as a political position, but as a divine calling, a duty to serve God and his people. He was a king who cared deeply about justice.
He would often hold court under an oak tree at Vincennes, listening to the grievances of his subjects and dispensing justice directly. He famously reformed the legal system, introducing royal courts that were fairer and more consistent than the old arbitrary feudal courts. He also banned the practice of trial by combat in his royal domain, replacing it with a more rational, evidence-based judicial inquiry. This was a massive step toward establishing a single unified legal system throughout France, a cornerstone of any modern state. He was a bit like a medieval superhero, fighting for justice and truth, just with a much nicer hat. His devotion to his faith, however, had its downsides. Louis IX was a zealous crusader. He was so committed to the idea of reclaiming the Holy Land that he led the disastrous Seventh Crusade to Egypt in 1248. The campaign was a military failure, ending with his entire army being captured and him having to be ransomed. Despite this, his reputation for piety only grew. He returned to France and continued his reforms, but the call of the Holy Land was strong. He launched the equally disastrous Eighth Crusade in 1270, this time to Tunis, where he and much of his army succumbed to disease. He died there, a martyr in the eyes of many, and was canonized by the Church just 27 years later. Historians still argue whether his devotion to the Crusades was a selfless act of faith or a political mistake that drained the kingdom of its resources and its king. Louis IX's reign wasn't just about piety and justice, though. It was also a period of cultural and intellectual flowering. He was a great patron of the arts and architecture. He commissioned the stunning Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, a Gothic masterpiece built to house his collection of holy relics, including the crown of thorns. This act was a display of royal piety and power, cementing Paris as the spiritual and political heart of France. He also fostered the growth of the University of Paris, which became one of the most important centers of learning in Europe. The king's foreign policy was also surprisingly effective, especially considering his crusade failures. He was known for his fairness and integrity. For example, he signed the Treaty of Paris with England in 1259, a landmark agreement where he gave the English king, Henry III, some territories in exchange for Henry's promise to formally renounce his claims to the French throne. This was a strategic move that, for a time, brought peace between the two kingdoms and solidified the gains of his grandfather, Philip II. The treaty showed Louis IX was more interested in long-term peace and stability than in constant warfare. He was, in many ways, a modern king in his approach to governance. Louis IX's legacy was immense. He had transformed the French monarchy from a powerful but still feudal institution into a sacred, centralized government. He gave the king a new moral authority and a reputation for justice that would last for centuries. He was, in many ways, the ultimate example of a medieval monarch, a powerful king, a devout Christian, and a reformer who laid the groundwork for the modern French state. He proved that a king didn't just have to be a great warrior to be successful. He could also be a wise and just ruler, and in doing so, he made the French monarchy something to be respected and revered. His reign was a crucial bridge between the messy, feudal world of his predecessors and the powerful, more centralized state of his successors. The reign of Louis IX had established a new kind of French monarchy, one built on piety and justice. But his grandson, Philip IV, known as the Fair for his good looks rather than his fair dealings, was a very different kind of king. He was a ruthless pragmatist, a legal-minded ruler who was more concerned with royal power and the state's finances than with saintly conduct. He came to the throne in 1285 and immediately set about the task of making the French crown not just a moral authority, but a genuine political and economic powerhouse. His reign would be a masterclass in the use of propaganda, legalism, and sheer intimidation to achieve his goals, and he would clash with two of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe, the papacy and the Knights Templar. Philip III's first major conflict was with Pope Boniface VIII. The issue, as it so often was money. Philip needed funds to pay for his wars, and he decided to tax the French clergy. Pope Boniface,
a staunch defender of papal authority, responded with a papal bull, Clericis Lycos, which forbade lay rulers from taxing the clergy without papal permission. This set off a massive constitutional crisis. Philip, in a show of pure defiance, banned the export of gold and silver from France, cutting off a major source of revenue for the papacy. The Pope eventually backed down, but the conflict flared up again when Philip arrested a French bishop who was a papal legate. Pope Boniface responded with another papal bull, Unum Sanctum, which declared that all earthly power was subject to the Pope, a direct and absolute claim of papal supremacy. This was a direct challenge to Philip's authority, and he wasn't about to take it lying down. He sent his chief minister, Guillaume de Nogaret, with a small force to Italy to arrest the Pope. The plan was a bit over the top, but they managed to capture the Pope in his home at Anagni. Although he was rescued a few days later, the humiliation was too much, and he died shortly thereafter. It was a massive blow to the prestige of the papacy, and it showed the world that a king, with enough will and ruthless cunning, could challenge even the spiritual head of Christendom. His next target was even more shocking: the Knights Templar. The Templars were a military monastic order that had been founded during the Crusades. Over the centuries, they had become fabulously wealthy, acting as the bankers of Europe and owning vast amounts of land. Philip IV, ever in need of money, owed them a huge debt. Instead of paying them back, he decided to just take their stuff. He orchestrated a massive secret operation. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, he had every Templar in France arrested on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and sodomy. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, and the confessions were extracted under torture, but Philip had the legal pretext he needed. He then had the Pope, who was now under his influence, issue a papal bull formally dissolving the order. The Templars' Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314, but before he died, he reportedly cursed Philip IV and the Pope, saying they would both die within the year. In a strange twist of historical coincidence, they both did. Historians still argue whether Philip's motivations were purely financial, or if he also genuinely feared the immense power of a monastic order that was loyal to no king. It was a brutal act, but it solved his financial problems and eliminated a powerful rival. It was a bit like a medieval version of a hostile corporate takeover, but with more flames. Philip IV's reign was a watershed moment in French history. He may have been a cold and unlikable king, but his actions were a huge step toward creating a modern, centralized state. He established a professional bureaucracy, a new class of civil servants and lawyers who were loyal to him and not to the old feudal order. He created royal tax collectors and was the first French king to regularly summon the Estates General, a representative body of the three estates, clergy, nobility, and commoners, to get their support for his policies, especially his new taxes. This was a masterful political move, a way to bypass the traditional power of the nobles and get the support of the rest of the kingdom. He proved that the king's power was not just a matter of feudal allegiances, but a matter of law and finance.
His brutal efficiency and his disregard for traditional power structures laid the groundwork for the absolute monarchy that would define France for centuries to come. His policies, however, also sowed the seeds of future conflict. He had created a powerful, centralized state, but his ruthless tactics had alienated the church and the nobility, creating resentments that would boil over in the coming years.
His death, and the death of his three sons without male heirs, would create a new kind of crisis, one that would plunge France into its longest and most devastating war. The glorious centralized kingdom, forged by Philip IV the Fair, was powerful, but it was also a fragile thing. His ruthless efficiency had created a new kind of French state, but it was still a monarchy dependent on a clear line of succession. His death in 1314, followed by the deaths of his three sons, Louis VI, Philip V, and Charles IV, all without a male heir, created an unprecedented crisis.
For a dynasty that had just, with great effort, established the principle of hereditary succession, this was a disaster. The line of succession had run out, and the French nobles were faced with a huge problem. Who would be the next king? The two main claimants were Philip of Valois, a nephew of Philip the Thor, and Edward III, the King of England, who was a grandson of Philip the Thord through his mother, Isabella.
The French nobles, remembering Philip II's brilliant work to expel the English, were in no mood to have an English king on the throne. They were not about to hand over the keys to the kingdom to a foreign rival, no matter how distant his claim. So, the French nobles used a very convenient and historically dubious law from the old Frankish code, the Salic law, which they claimed prohibited female succession to the throne. This meant that Edward III's claim, which came through his mother, was invalid. The nobles chose Philip VI of Valois as the new king, a decision that would lead to one of the longest and most devastating conflicts in European history, the 100 Years' War. Edward III initially accepted this decision, but later, when tensions flared up over the French king's support for Scotland and interference in the lucrative English wool trade with Flanders, he formally claimed the French throne in 1337. It was a bold move, a claim that was technically weak but politically useful, and it was the official start of the war. The war was a complicated, multi-generational affair, a mix of grand battles, long sieges, and brutal raids. It wasn't a continuous 100-year conflict, but a series of intermittent wars separated by periods of truce. The first phase of the war was an unmitigated disaster for the French. The English, with their longbows and a more professional army, were far superior on the battlefield. The French, with their chivalrous but tactically outdated mounted knights, were completely outmatched. The French nobility, steeped in a code of chivalry that valued individual glory over military effectiveness, rode into battle with a confidence that was not matched by their results. Historians still argue about the exact reasons for the French military's failures, debating whether it was a tactical superiority of the English longbow or a fundamental flaw in the French feudal army's structure and leadership.
The English longbow was a game changer. It was a powerful weapon that could fire arrows at a high rate of speed and pierce the armor of a knight at a distance. The French, in their heavy armor, were like sitting ducks. The first major French defeat came at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. The French king, Philip VI, with a massive army, charged head-on into a well-positioned English force and was completely routed. Thousands of French knights were killed, and the French monarchy was humiliated. The English, under Edward III, then went on to capture the key port city of Calais, which they would hold for over 200 years. The defeat at Crécy was a clear sign that the old ways of fighting were no longer working, but it was a lesson that the French would be slow to learn. It was a bit like bringing a very shiny but ultimately useless sword to a gunfight.
The next major French defeat came at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. The French king, John II, was in command of a larger army, but the result was the same. The English, led by the fearsome Black Prince, son of Edward III, once again used their longbowmen to devastating effect. The battle was a complete rout, and to make matters worse, King John II was captured and taken to England as a prisoner. The capture of the king was an unprecedented humiliation for the French monarchy. It left the kingdom rudderless, with a massive ransom to pay and a deep sense of despair. The war was not just a military conflict, it was a crisis of French identity. The glorious legacy of the Capetians seemed to be over, and the kingdom was on the verge of collapse. The stage was set for a period of internal chaos, peasant revolts, and a devastating plague that would make the war seem like just one of many problems for the French people.
The disastrous defeats at Crécy and Poitiers had left France reeling. The king was a prisoner in England, a massive ransom was demanded, and the Dauphin, Charles, was left to pick up the pieces of a broken kingdom. The French nobility, the proud and chivalrous class that had been so soundly defeated, was in a state of shock and humiliation.
But as bad as things were, an even greater horror was about to descend upon the kingdom. A terrifying, indiscriminate killer that would make the war seem like a distant second-place problem. This was the Black Death, and it would fundamentally reshape the entire social, economic, and political landscape of France.
The plague arrived in France in 1347 and over the next few years would kill an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. It was a disease of unimaginable terror, a biological force that didn't care about social class or military prowess. Monks in their monasteries, knights in their castles, and peasants in their huts all fell victim to the same horrible, painful death. The death of so many people had a huge and lasting impact on the feudal system.
The old order, where peasants were tied to the land, was no longer sustainable. With so many people dead, labor became a scarce and valuable commodity. Peasants who survived could demand higher wages and better conditions, which put a huge strain on the nobles who were already struggling to pay for the war and their own extravagant lifestyles. This was a huge economic shift.
It was a bit like a medieval market suddenly running out of all its employees, leaving the bosses to wonder how they would ever get anything done. The Black Death was a great equalizer, a biological force that reshaped the entire social and economic landscape of France. Historians still argue about whether the plague was the final death blow to the feudal system or just a powerful accelerator of changes that were already underway. But the worst was yet to come. In the aftermath of the Battle of Poitiers, the kingdom was in chaos. The ransom for the king was crippling, and the government, led by the young Dauphin, was seen as weak and ineffective. The country was overrun with free companies, bands of unemployed mercenaries, who, with no war to fight, roamed the countryside, pillaging and extorting money from the peasants. This added to the sense of lawlessness and despair.
The peasants, who were already struggling with the plague and the demands of their lords, were pushed to the breaking point. The nobility, meanwhile, was seen as having failed in their primary duty, to protect the kingdom. The knights had been humiliated in battle, and were now seen as more of a liability than a source of security.
This sense of injustice and despair boiled over in 1358 with a massive peasant uprising known as the Jacquerie. The name comes from Jacques Bonhomme, a derogatory name for a French peasant. The revolt began in the north of France and quickly spread, with peasants attacking castles and killing nobles. It was a brutal and violent affair, a true social revolution, driven by rage and desperation.
The peasants, armed with farm implements and sheer numbers, went on a rampage, a wild, chaotic outburst against the people they saw as their oppressors. The nobility, shocked and terrified by the violence, responded with equal ferocity. They united to crush the revolt, and the repression was incredibly brutal. Tens of thousands of peasants were massacred, and the revolt was stamped out with a swift and terrible vengeance. The Jacquerie was a clear sign that the old feudal order was breaking down. The relationship between the nobility and the peasantry, which was supposed to be one of mutual protection and obligation, had been shattered. The king was a prisoner, the nobility was discredited, and the common people were in open revolt. The Hundred Years' War was just one of the problems facing France. The kingdom was also struggling with internal divisions, social unrest, and a devastating plague. It was a period of profound crisis, a true dark age for the French people. The young Dauphin, Charles, who had been an onlooker to this chaos, would have to learn from these mistakes and somehow restore order to a kingdom that was on the verge of collapse. He would have to become a new kind of king, one who understood that the old ways were no longer working and that the French state needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. He would have to find a way to navigate a new world that was more brutal, more chaotic, and more unpredictable than ever before. The chaos and despair of the Jacquerie and the plague had left the French kingdom in a state of deep crisis. The Dauphin, Charles, who would eventually become Charles V, was faced with a monumental task. He was not a warrior like his father, John II, but a thoughtful and intellectual man who was better suited to a library than a battlefield. He was nicknamed the Wise, and he would live up to that name, becoming one of the most effective and successful kings of the medieval period. He understood that the old way of fighting the English, with massed charges of chivalrous but ineffective knights, was no longer working. He needed a new strategy, a new army, and a new way of governing. Charles the Revere's first task was to restore order to his own kingdom, a land that was still reeling from peasant revolts and the threat of the free companies. These bands of unemployed mercenaries had become a scourge on the countryside, and Charles dealt with them with a cunning pragmatism. He didn't just fight them, he hired them to fight elsewhere, or bought them off with gold, a masterful way of turning a threat into a tool. He successfully put down a rebellion in Paris, led by a merchant named Etienne Marcel, proving that he had the political savvy to control his own capital. He then set about reforming the French military. He focused on building up a professional army, not one based on feudal obligations, but on paid soldiers who were disciplined and effective. He also invested heavily in artillery and fortifications, understanding that sieges, not open battles, would be the key to winning the war. He famously told his commanders to avoid pitched battles, a strategy that was a complete reversal of the old chivalric code. It was a bit like a medieval coach telling his team to just keep running out the clock and not score. A very unchivalric but very effective way to win. His most brilliant move was to appoint a brilliant Breton knight, Bertrand du Guesclin, as his constable of France. Du Guesclin was the perfect general for Charles VI's strategy. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, a cunning strategist who excelled at ambushes, surprise attacks, and sieges. He wasn't a noble of the highest rank, which made him an ideal choice for a king who wanted to move away from the old, ineffective noble commanders. Together, Charles V and Du Guesclin began the long, slow, and grinding process of reconquering the territories lost to the English. This was a Fabian strategy, named after a Roman general who avoided direct confrontation, a war of attrition, using small targeted campaigns to wear the English down. They systematically retook Normandy, Poitou, and other key territories. The English, who were used to winning glorious battles, were completely frustrated by this new style of warfare. The tide of the war, for the first time, was turning in France's favor. Charles de Charleville's successes weren't just military. He was also a master of finance and administration. He stabilized the kingdom's finances, created a more efficient tax system, and was a great patron of the arts and learning. He famously built the Bastille fortress in Paris, not as a prison, but as a formidable defense for the city, a symbol of his commitment to protecting his capital. He also created the first royal library in France, a symbol of his love for knowledge and his belief in the power of education. He was a king who understood that a kingdom was more than just a collection of lands. It was a state, a legal and administrative entity that needed to be run efficiently. His reign was a brief but brilliant period of recovery for France, a period that came to be known as the Recuperation.
By the time of Charles the Fourier's death in 1380, the French kingdom had been transformed. The English had been pushed back to a small coastal strip around Calais, and the kingdom was once again powerful and centralized. The Valois dynasty, which had started with such a humiliating defeat, was now seen as a legitimate and successful ruling house.
Charles V had proven that a king didn't have to be a great warrior to be successful. He could be a great administrator and a cunning strategist, and that was more than enough to turn the tide of a war. Historians still argue whether Charles V's Fabian strategy was a sign of military genius or a pragmatic response to the proven failures of the old chivalric ways. He was a new kind of monarch for a new kind of war, a king who understood that sometimes the most effective way to win is to simply not lose. The kingdom was back on its feet, but the peace would not last. A new period of internal turmoil and a mad king would soon throw France back into chaos, a tragic regression from the order and stability he had so carefully built.
The recovery of France under Charles V the Wise was a remarkable achievement, but it was all to come undone with his successor. Charles VI came to the throne as a young boy, and for a time it seemed as though the kingdom would continue on its path of prosperity. However, in 1392, while on a military campaign, he suffered a severe mental breakdown. He went into a murderous rage, killing several of his own knights, and was only subdued after his men knocked him off his horse. This was just the first of many episodes of what was likely schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. For the rest of his long reign, Charles VI would suffer from periods of complete lucidity, followed by long stretches of madness, during which he believed he was made of glass, or was a different person altogether. He was nicknamed the Mad, a tragic but fitting name for a king whose mental illness would plunge the kingdom into civil war. With the king incapacitated, France was rudderless, and the country was governed by a regency council made up of the king's powerful uncles and his younger brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans. This immediately led to a power struggle. The two main factions were the Armagnacs, led by the Duke of Orleans, and the Burgundians, led by John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy.
The conflict was not just a squabble between two ambitious nobles. It was a deeply personal, violent feud that would tear the kingdom apart. The Burgundians, with their vast land holdings in the east of France and Flanders, were rich, powerful, and often acted as a state within a state. The Armagnacs, led by the king's brother, were the more traditional royalists.
The rivalry escalated into a full-blown civil war in 1407, when John the Fearless, in a shocking act of political murder, had Louis of Orleans assassinated on the streets of Paris. The act was a declaration of war, and the two factions plunged France into a period of chaos and violence. The Burgundians, who were popular in Paris due to their anti-tax policies, even had the support of the Parisian mob.
This internal division was a disaster for France, and it gave the English, who had been licking their wounds since the time of Charles V, the perfect opportunity to re-enter the war. The English king, Henry V, a brilliant and ambitious monarch, saw France's civil war as a golden ticket. He landed in France in 1415 with a small, well-disciplined army and began a campaign of conquest. The French, divided and fighting each other, were no match for him. The two factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, were too consumed by their own hatred to unite against the common enemy. The culmination of this was the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. The French, with a massive army, once again charged a smaller, well-positioned English force in a field of mud. The result was a catastrophic defeat, a replay of Crécy and Poitiers, but even more humiliating. Thousands of French knights were killed, and the flower of the French nobility was wiped out. The battle was a national tragedy, a moment of profound despair for the French people.
Historians still argue whether the French defeat at Agincourt was a result of English tactical genius and the use of the longbow, or simply the result of French hubris and poor leadership in the muddy conditions. It was a clear sign that the old chivalric ways were not just ineffective, but actively dangerous. The English, under Henry the Fifth, now had the momentum. They allied with the Burgundians, who saw the English as a useful tool to crush their Armagnac rivals. The combined English and Burgundian forces conquered the north of France, including Paris. In 1420, with the Mad King still on the throne, Henry V forced the French court to sign the Treaty of Troyes. The treaty was a complete capitulation. It disinherited the Dauphin, Charles, and named Henry V as the heir to the French throne. Henry VI then married the French princess Catherine to seal the deal. The treaty was a final crushing blow to French sovereignty. It meant that with the death of Charles VI, France would effectively become part of an Anglo-French kingdom ruled by an English king. The French monarchy, which had been so brilliantly rebuilt by Philip II and Charles IV, was now on the brink of being erased from history. The kingdom was a complete mess, a land of civil war and foreign occupation, a complete reversal of the hard-won victories of the previous generation. France was at its lowest point. The kingdom was fractured, with the north under English and Burgundian control, a mad king on the throne, and the Dauphin, Charles, disinherited and a prince without a kingdom. He was a frail, uncharismatic figure, so lacking in confidence that he even doubted if he was the true son of Charles VI. He had fled south of the Loire River, a region that was still loyal to him, but his authority was weak, and his court was a disorganized mess. He was, to put it mildly, a king in name only, a punchline to the English and Burgundian courts. The English were systematically consolidating their gains, and the city of Orléans, a key strategic location on the Loire River, was under siege. If Orléans fell, the English would have a clear path to the rest of the loyal French territories, and the Valois dynasty would be over. The situation was hopeless, and despair was the dominant mood in the French court.
And then she arrived. Her name was Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl from a small village in the east of France. She claimed to have been sent by God to save France and to have the Dauphin crowned king. Her story is one of the most incredible and improbable in all of history. She was illiterate, knew nothing of military strategy, and yet she convinced the Dauphin's court, a group of cynical and battle-hardened nobles, that she was the real deal. She did this with a combination of unwavering faith, a directness that cut through the court's political bickering, and most importantly, a series of accurate prophecies about the state of the war. Charles, ever cautious, had her vetted by a council of theologians and was eventually convinced of her sincerity. He gave her a suit of armor and a small army, and she marched to Orléans. The city was on the brink of surrender, but her arrival had an electrifying effect. She was a symbol of hope, a messianic figure who revitalized the French army and the people of the city. She led a series of daring attacks on the English fortifications, and in a remarkably short time, the siege was broken. The victory at Orleans was a massive turning point, not just militarily, but psychologically. It gave the French a sense of divine purpose, a belief that God was on their side. After the relief of Orleans, Joan's next major goal was to get Charles crowned king. A proper coronation at Reims Cathedral, the traditional site for French coronations, would legitimize his claim to the throne and rally the French people to his banner. Reims, however, was deep in Burgundian territory, and the journey seemed impossible. Against the advice of his generals, Charles, spurred on by Joan, made the journey. The campaign was a masterstroke. The French army, inspired by Joan, marched through enemy territory, and a series of towns and cities opened their gates to them without a fight. The journey culminated in the crowning of Charles VII at Reims Cathedral in 1429. It was a hugely symbolic moment. Charles was no longer just the Dauphin. He was the anointed king of France, a ruler whose authority was now sanctioned by God. He was a real king, and his new legitimacy was a huge blow to the English and their Burgundian allies. After the coronation, Joan's luck began to run out. Her influence at court waned, and the king and his cautious advisors were more interested in diplomacy than in open warfare. She continued to fight, but without the full support of the court, her campaigns were less successful. She was eventually captured by the Burgundians in 1430 while trying to relieve a siege at Compiègne. The Burgundians, seeing her as a valuable political prisoner, sold her to the English for a massive ransom. Her trial was a travesty of justice, a political show trial orchestrated by the English and their French collaborators to discredit her and the king. She was convicted of heresy and burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431, a horrific act that turned her into a martyr. She was only 19 years old. Historians still argue about whether Joan was a divinely inspired prophet or a brilliant military leader who used the religious fervor of the age to her advantage. Joan of Arc's story, for all its tragedy, was the catalyst for the French victory in the 100 Years' War. She gave the French a hero, a symbol of resistance, and most importantly, she gave the king the legitimacy and the confidence he needed to win. Her impact was incalculable. She turned a losing war into a struggle for national liberation, and in doing so, she helped to create the modern French nation. Her legend would grow over the centuries, turning her into a national icon, a symbol of French patriotism and resilience. She had given Charles VII the final piece of the puzzle he needed to win, a sense of divine right and purpose that would allow him to finally drive the English out of France and bring an end to the long, bloody conflict. With Joan of Arc's martyrdom, the tide had turned irrevocably in favor of the French. Charles VII, once a timid and insecure prince, was now a legitimate, anointed king. He had learned from his mistakes and from the lessons of his father, Charles VI the Mad. He understood that to win the war, he had to be patient, cunning, and ruthless.
His reign would be the story of how he, a king who started with almost nothing, would systematically drive the English out of France and bring an end to the long, devastating conflict. He surrounded himself with a new generation of advisors, men of humble origins, who were loyal to him and who understood the new realities of warfare and finance. He was, in many ways, a modern king in the making, a monarch who understood that the old feudal way of doing things was no longer working.
The king's first major task was to make peace with the most powerful of his French rivals, the Duke of Burgundy. The alliance between Burgundy and England was the primary reason for France's ongoing humiliation. In 1435, Charles VII signed the Treaty of Arras with Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy. The terms of the treaty were a monumental diplomatic victory for the French.
In exchange for some political concessions and a formal, if somewhat humiliating, apology for the assassination of the Duke's father. Philip the Good recognized Charles VII as the rightful king of France, and most importantly, broke his alliance with England. This was a turning point in the war. With Burgundy no longer a threat, the English were isolated and vulnerable, fighting a war on French soil without the support of the local population. With Burgundy on his side, Charles VII was able to focus on the English. He continued the military reforms of his grandfather, Charles V, creating a standing army that was professional, well-paid, and disciplined. He also invested heavily in siege technology, particularly in the use of artillery, which had become a game-changer on the battlefield. The English, who had relied on their longbowmen and their superior tactics, were now faced with a new kind of warfare.
The cannons could breach the walls of castles and fortifications that had once been impregnable. The English strongholds, which had been the basis of their power in France, were no longer safe. The systematic reconquest began with a long, grinding campaign to recapture Normandy, a territory that had been English for centuries. This wasn't a war of glorious battles, but of methodical sieges and careful military maneuvering.
The final battles of the war were a testament to this new French military might. The Battle of Formigny in 1450 was a decisive French victory that marked the end of English rule in Normandy. The French, with their professional army and their new artillery, completely routed the English forces. The Battle of Castillon in 1453 was the final major battle of the war. Once again, the French, with their cannons and their professional soldiers, won a crushing victory. The English commander, the legendary John Talbot, was killed, and the English army was annihilated. The battle was a symbolic end to the war. The English, who had once come so close to conquering France, were now pushed back to a small coastal strip around Calais, the last vestige of their vast French Empire. Historians still argue whether the French victory was due to military innovation and the use of artillery, or simply the exhaustion and internal strife of England, which was now dealing with its own succession crisis. The 100 Years' War was over, and France had won. It had come at a huge cost, with decades of warfare, plague, and internal strife. But the outcome was a new, stronger France. Charles VII had proven that a king could be a brilliant strategist and administrator, even if he wasn't a charismatic warrior. His reign was the culmination of a long, slow process of centralization and nation-building that had begun with the early Capetians. The old feudal order was dead, and a new, powerful, and centralized monarchy was now in its place. The king was no longer just the most powerful noble. He was the sovereign ruler of a unified nation, a monarch who had defeated his foreign enemies and restored order to his own kingdom. The stage was now set for his successors to continue this work and to create the powerful, absolute monarchy that would define the next few centuries of French history. His legacy was immense, and the kingdom he left behind was a testament to his quiet, methodical genius. The long, bloody 100 Years' War was finally over, but France was still a fractured kingdom. While Charles VII had driven the English out, the great nobles, particularly the Duke of Burgundy, remained incredibly powerful, acting as a state within a state. The stage was set for a new kind of king, one who would finally break the power of the nobility and consolidate the French kingdom into a truly centralized state. That king was Louis XI, the son of Charles VII, a man so cunning and ruthless that he was nicknamed the Spider King. He was a complete contrast to his father, a king who was more comfortable with spies and diplomats than with the knights and soldiers. His reign, from 1461 to 1483, was a masterclass in political maneuvering, a period of constant scheming and intrigue
that would finally bring the medieval feudal order to a close. Louis the Chalmon's primary rival was Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy. Charles was the last of the great medieval warrior dukes, a man who dreamed of creating his own kingdom, a new Middle Kingdom between France and the Holy Roman Empire. He was a perfect foil for Louis XIV, a chivalrous, hot-headed, and ambitious duke, against a calculating, patient, and treacherous king. Their rivalry was not just a political struggle, it was a clash of two different worlds, with Charles representing the old, glorious feudal order, and Louis representing the new, more pragmatic, and centralized state. Louis XVI, instead of confronting Charles in open battle, chose a different path. He used a network of spies and agents to sow discord and chaos in Charles's domains. He funded rebellions, turned Charles's own vassals against him, and used diplomacy to isolate him.
He was a master of the divide and conquer strategy, a king who understood that the pen and the purse were often more powerful than the sword. It was a bit like a medieval supervillain, just without the cool costume. One of Louis XVI's most brilliant moves was his strategic use of towns and cities. The urban centers, with their growing merchant class, were a natural ally for the king against the old feudal nobility. Louis XIV granted these towns new charters and privileges, giving them more autonomy in exchange for their loyalty and taxes. This created a new power base for the monarchy, one that was not tied to the old feudal system. The king was now seen as the protector of the common people against the avarice of the nobility, a move that gave him immense popular support and a steady stream of income. He was a king who had the courage to look at the old ways of doing things and say, yeah, that's not going to work anymore. This was a fundamental shift in the relationship between the monarchy and the people, a new kind of social contract that would have a huge impact on the future of France. The climax of Louis XVIII's struggle with Burgundy came not from a French victory, but from Charles the Bold's own overreach. Charles was constantly at war, trying to expand his territories, and in 1477 he was killed at the Battle of Nancy. His death was a massive turning point. Charles died without a male heir, and his vast Burgundian lands were left for grabs.
Louis XI, ever the opportunist, immediately moved in and annexed the core of the Burgundian territory, including the wealthy duchy itself. This was a monumental acquisition. It added a massive amount of land, wealth, and power to the French royal domain, and it forever removed the greatest threat to the Capetian monarchy. It was a victory won not on the battlefield, but through patience, diplomacy, and a healthy dose of good luck. Historians still argue whether his reign marked the true end of the medieval period or just the beginning of a new kind of tyranny, a state where the power of the king was unchecked by the old feudal traditions. Louis XII's reign wasn't just about destroying his enemies, it was also about building a new state. He established a new system of royal administration, one that was more centralized and efficient than ever before. He created a new class of civil servants, the maîtres des requêtes, who administered justice and collected taxes in the name of the king. He also established a new system of royal courts, which slowly but surely eroded the power of the old feudal courts.
He was a king who understood the power of the state and who was willing to use any means necessary to build it. By the time of his death, he had transformed France from a collection of powerful feudal states into a powerful centralized kingdom, a monarchy that was on the verge of becoming absolute. He was a paranoid and unlikable king, but his legacy was immense.
He had finished the work of his predecessors and had created the foundation for the powerful kingdom that would define the next 2 centuries of French history. The stage was set for a new era, one of glory and grandeur,
and a new kind of cultural flowering that would forever change the face of France.
The cunning and ruthless reign of Louis XV, the Spider King, had finally brought an end to the medieval feudal order. The great nobles were broken, the kingdom was centralized, and a powerful state had been forged. France was now a unified, powerful nation, but it was on the cusp of a new and profound cultural transformation. The dawn of the French Renaissance was a period of immense artistic, intellectual, and cultural change that would transform the kingdom. While Italy had been the epicenter of this movement for over a century, France's involvement in the Italian wars in the late 15th and early 16th centuries brought French kings and nobles into direct contact with the vibrant art, architecture, and ideas of the Italian city-states. The French were completely captivated by what they saw. It was a new world of classical learning, humanism, and artistic expression, a stark contrast to the religious and feudal art of the Middle Ages. This was a moment of profound cultural awakening, a time when the French were, for the first time, seeing themselves not just as a kingdom, but as a cultural powerhouse. The most famous patron of this new age was Francis I, who came to the throne in 1515. He was a quintessential Renaissance monarch, a warrior, a diplomat, and a generous patron of the arts. He was charismatic, athletic, and had a love for all things beautiful. He famously invited Italian artists and thinkers to his court, including the legendary Leonardo da Vinci, who spent his last years in France as the king's official painter and engineer.
Da Vinci brought with him the Mona Lisa, which Francis I acquired, and which remains in the Louvre to this day. Francis I's court became a hub of artistic and intellectual activity, a place where ideas and innovations from Italy were absorbed and transformed into a uniquely French style. He was a king who understood that cultural prestige was just as important as military might, and he used art and architecture to project his power and glory. He was a bit like a modern tech mogul who understood that having the best talent was just as important as having the best product. Francis I's grandest architectural project was the construction of the magnificent Château de Chambord in the Loire Valley. This massive hunting lodge was a perfect fusion of French medieval tradition and Italian Renaissance style. With its soaring towers, intricate roofline, and classical motifs, it was a symbol of the new French monarchy, a powerful and sophisticated court that was a rival to any in Europe. The king also rebuilt parts of the Louvre Palace in Paris and oversaw the construction of the beautiful Château de Fontainebleau. He was a patron of writers and scholars, helping to establish the printing press in France and commissioning translations of classical texts. In 1539, he signed the Ordinance of Villers-Cotterêts, which mandated that French be used in all legal documents, a hugely important step in centralizing the state and promoting a national identity. His reign, however, was also defined by a long and bitter rivalry with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. This was a classic clash of two powerful rulers vying for supremacy in Europe. Charles V, a member of the powerful Habsburg dynasty, controlled a massive empire that included Spain, the Netherlands, and large parts of Germany and Italy. He essentially surrounded France on all sides, a constant threat to French security. The two men fought a series of wars for control of Italy and for dominance in Europe. Francis I, despite some early victories, was often outmatched by Charles IV's vast resources. He was even captured at the Battle of Pavia in 1525, a humiliating defeat that forced him to sign a treaty of capitulation. But he was a wily opponent, and once released, immediately repudiated the treaty and continued the fight. Historians still argue whether this rivalry was a purely personal feud between two ambitious men or a necessary geopolitical struggle for a new balance of power in Europe. The rivalry between Francis I and Charles V was a major geopolitical struggle that shaped the course of 16th century Europe. It was a conflict between a new kind of monarch, a French king who was a master of diplomacy and cultural patronage, and an old kind of emperor, a Habsburg who dreamed of a unified, universal empire.
The struggle was inconclusive, but it left France with a new sense of national identity, a powerful monarchy, and a cultural flowering that would define the next few centuries. The French Renaissance, started under Francis I, was a period of immense creativity and innovation, but it was also a time of deep religious tension. The Reformation, which had started in Germany, was now making its way to France, and the kingdom was about to be plunged into a new kind of conflict, one that was even more brutal and divisive than the wars with England. The stage was set for a new era of chaos and civil war, a stark contrast to the cultural brilliance of Francis I's court. The French Renaissance under Francis I had been a period of cultural brilliance, but it was also a time of deep religious upheaval. The Protestant Reformation, which had started with Martin Luther's 95 Theses in Germany, had spread across Europe, and its ideas were now making their way into France. The French Protestants, known as Huguenots, were a growing minority, particularly among the nobility and the urban merchant class. At first, the French monarchy, under Francis I, had been relatively tolerant, but a turning point came in 1534 with the affair of the placards, where anti-Catholic posters were put up all over Paris and even on the king's bedroom door. This was seen as a direct attack on the king's authority, and Francis I began a period of brutal repression, burning Protestants at the stake and forcing others to flee. The quiet theological debates of the Reformation were about to become a very loud, very bloody civil war.
The religious tensions continued to simmer for decades, and with the death of the powerful King Henry II in 1559, a new period of royal weakness began. The king's sons were young and ineffective, and the kingdom was plunged into a power struggle between two powerful noble families. The two main rival families were the Catholic House of Guise and the Protestant House of Bourbon.
The Guises, who were staunch Catholics, had the support of the Pope in Spain, while the Bourbons, who were Protestants, had the support of England and the German princes. The kingdom was on a knife's edge, a ticking time bomb of religious and political animosity. The old feudal conflicts had now been given a new, more dangerous layer of religious fervor, making compromise nearly impossible. The conflict erupted into the French Wars of Religion, a brutal and complicated series of 8 civil wars that would last for over 3 decades. The First War began in 1562 after the Duke of Guise ordered the massacre of a group of Huguenots at Vassy. This set off a chain reaction of violence and revenge across the country. The wars were incredibly brutal, a mix of grand battles and local massacres. The country was completely divided, with brother fighting brother and neighbor killing neighbor. The king, Charles IX, was a young and weak ruler, and his mother, Catherine de' Medici, a powerful and cunning queen, tried to play the factions against each other, a strategy that would ultimately fail spectacularly. She was a kingmaker in a world where the kings were either too young or too weak to rule, a woman trying to hold a kingdom together with a series of very desperate, very clumsy political maneuvers. The culmination of the violence came in 1572 with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The massacre was orchestrated by Catherine de' Medici, who was concerned about the growing influence of the Huguenot leader, Admiral Coligny, over her son, the king. On the night of August 24th, as many of the Huguenot nobles were in Paris for the wedding of the Protestant Henry of Navarre to the king's sister, a prearranged signal was given. The Catholics of Paris, led by the Guise family, went on a rampage, killing thousands of Huguenots, including Coligny himself. The violence spread to other cities and continued for weeks. with estimates of the dead ranging from 5,000 to 30,000. It was a horrific act that shattered any pretense of religious tolerance and left a permanent scar on the French psyche. It was a dark day for France, a moment of profound moral failure that would be remembered for centuries. The massacre, instead of ending the wars, just made them more brutal. The Huguenots, now convinced that they could not trust the crown, fought with a renewed sense of purpose. The wars continued for another 20 years, a period of chaos and bloodshed that left the French economy in tatters and the monarchy in a state of deep crisis. The wars were a testament to the destructive power of religious intolerance and the weakness of the monarchy. The Valois dynasty, which had started with such promise under Francis I, was now a spent force, a line of weak kings and a queen who had presided over a national tragedy. The wars were a bloody and confusing mess, with alliances constantly shifting and 3 different kings named Henry fighting for control in the final phase.
Historians still argue whether the French wars of religion were truly about religious differences, or if religion was simply a tool used by noble factions to fight for political power. Either way, the kingdom was on the verge of total collapse, and it would take a new kind of leader to bring it back from the brink.
The French wars of religion had torn the kingdom apart, leaving the Valois dynasty a spent force. With the assassination of Henry III, the last Valois king, in 1589, the throne passed to a distant cousin and the leader of the Huguenots, Henry of Navarre. This created a huge problem. A Protestant king was anathema to the vast majority of the French population, who were still fiercely Catholic, and the Catholic League, a powerful faction backed by Spain, refused to accept him as their king. France was on the brink of being carved up by foreign powers and consumed by endless civil war. But Henry of Navarre was not just a great military commander. He was also a brilliant pragmatist, a man who understood that to rule France, he had to be more than a Protestant hero. He had to be a king for all the French people, or there wouldn't be a French kingdom left to rule.
He fought for 4 years to secure his claim, besieging Paris and winning a series of battles against the Catholic League and their Spanish allies. But he knew that military victory alone would not be enough. The city of Paris, the heart of the kingdom, was in the hands of the Catholic League, and it was clear they would never accept a Protestant king. So, in one of the most famous political moves in French history, Henry made a choice.
In 1593, he converted to Catholicism, famously saying, "Paris is well worth a mass." This was a momentous decision, a sign that he was putting the stability and unity of France above his own personal beliefs. The conversion was a huge blow to his Protestant supporters, but a masterful political move. It took the wind out of the sails of the Catholic League, and the city of Paris, relieved to have a Catholic king, opened its gates to him. It was probably the most politically convenient religious conversion in all of history.
Historians still argue whether Henry's conversion was an act of genuine faith or a purely political calculation, but the result was the same. It allowed him to finally take control of his kingdom. Henry IV, as he was now known, was a new kind of king. He was a survivor of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a man who had seen the horrors of religious war firsthand, and he was determined to end the conflict once and for all. His most significant achievement was the Edict of Nantes, which he signed in 1598. The edict was a landmark piece of legislation that granted the Huguenots a degree of religious freedom. It allowed them to practice their faith in certain areas, hold public office, and even maintain their own fortified cities, a kind of state within a state. It was a compromise, not a declaration of full religious tolerance, but it was a crucial step toward peace.
It officially ended the wars of religion and for the first time in decades, a fragile peace came to the kingdom.
Henry IV's reign was a period of recovery and reconstruction. He was a king who was genuinely popular with the common people, earning the nickname Good King Henry. He worked to restore the country's finances, rebuild its infrastructure, and promote agriculture. He famously said that he wanted every peasant to have a chicken in his pot every Sunday, a line that perfectly captured his concern for the welfare of his people. He was also a king who understood the power of a strong central government. He systematically brought the rebellious nobles to heel, using a combination of charm, threats, and bribes to ensure their loyalty. He was a king who had the charisma of a leader and the cunning of a politician, a perfect combination for a kingdom that was just recovering from a half-century of civil war. He was a king who was not just a symbol, but a real administrator, a leader who understood that a stable, prosperous kingdom was the best way to ensure his own power. His life, however, came to a tragic end. In 1610, he was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic, a man who was angered by his policy of religious tolerance. His death was a huge loss for France. He had not only brought an end to the wars of religion, but had also laid the groundwork for the powerful centralized state that would define France for the next 2 centuries. He was the founder of the Bourbon dynasty, a line of kings that would rule France until the French Revolution, and his reign was a pivotal moment in the history of the French monarchy. He had proven that a king could be a master of politics as well as a military commander, and his legacy was one of peace, prosperity, and a new kind of French state. His work of rebuilding the French kingdom from the ground up would be continued by a new, more ruthless figure, a man who would take the tools of statecraft that Henry had created and use them to create an absolute monarchy. The assassination of Henry IV in 1610 was a huge setback for France, but the work he had begun would not be undone. His son, Louis XIII, was only 9 years old when he came to the throne, and the kingdom was once again ruled by a regent, his mother Marie de Medici. The regency was a period of political instability, with the great nobles trying to regain the power they had lost under Henry IV.
The kingdom was on the verge of falling back into civil war, but a new figure was about to emerge who would forever change the course of French history. His name was Armand Jean Duplessis, a man we know better as Cardinal Richelieu. He was not a king, but he was a kingmaker, and, for all practical purposes, a king himself. Richelieu was a brilliant politician and a shrewd statesman. He rose through the ranks of the church and the royal court, and in 1624 he was appointed as the king's chief minister. For the next 18 years, he was the de facto ruler of France, and his policies would be a masterclass in the consolidation of royal power. He had a clear vision for France, a powerful centralized kingdom with a strong monarchy at its head, and a France that was a major player on the European stage.
He was not a popular man, and he was often ruthless in his methods, but his actions were a huge step toward creating the absolute monarchy that would define France for the next century and a half. Richelieu's famous red cardinal's robes became a symbol of his power and his unyielding will. Richelieu's first priority was to deal with the threat of the Huguenots. The Edict of Nantes, while a step toward peace, had also created a state within a state by allowing the Huguenots to maintain their own fortified cities, most notably the powerful port city of La Rochelle. Richelieu saw this as a direct challenge to the king's authority. He systematically began to dismantle the Huguenots' military and political power, culminating in the siege of La Rochelle in 1627. La Rochelle, a major Huguenot stronghold, had the support of the English, and the siege became a major military and political conflict. Richelieu personally oversaw the campaign, building a massive seawall to block the harbor and starving the city into submission. The city surrendered after a year, and the Huguenots lost all of their military and political rights. They were still allowed to practice their religion, but they were no longer a military or political threat. It was a clear message that there was only one power in France: the king, and by extension, his chief minister.
His next target was the great nobles. Richelieu understood that the power of the French aristocracy was the primary obstacle to a strong central government. He systematically suppressed their rebellions, destroyed their fortified castles, and banned the practice of dueling, a practice he saw as a direct challenge to the king's justice. He was a master of using spies and informants, and he was not afraid to use the headsman's axe to deal with rebellious nobles, regardless of their rank.
It was a bit like a medieval mob boss who took the business of running a kingdom a little too seriously. He created a new class of royal officials, the intendants, who were sent out to the provinces to administer justice, collect taxes, and report directly to the king. These intendants were not nobles, but commoners who owed their loyalty entirely to the king, a move that bypassed the old feudal system and created a new, efficient bureaucracy.
Richelieu was also a master of foreign policy. He was a devout Catholic, but he was also a pragmatist. He saw the Habsburg dynasty of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire as the main threat to France's security. So, in one of the most stunning diplomatic reversals of the century, he allied with the Protestant states of Europe, including Sweden and the Netherlands, to fight against the Catholic Habsburgs in the 30 Years' War. His policy was simple: weaken the Habsburgs and expand France's power and influence in Europe. He was a true practitioner of raison d'etat, or reason of state, a political philosophy that put the interests of the state above all other considerations, even religion. Historians still argue whether Richelieu was a selfless servant of the state or a ruthless man driven by personal ambition, but his policies certainly made France a dominant force in Europe.
By the time of his death in 1642, he had transformed France from a divided and threatened kingdom into a powerful, centralized state, a major player on the European stage, and he had laid the groundwork for the absolute monarchy that would follow.
Cardinal Richelieu's work had laid the groundwork for a new kind of France, one where the king's power was absolute, but his death in 1642 didn't immediately lead to that reality. Louis XIV died a year later, and his son, the future Louis XIV, was only 5 years old. The kingdom was once again ruled by a regent, the Queen Mother, Anne of Austria, and a new chief minister, another brilliant cardinal, Jules Mazarin. Mazarin was Richelieu's protégé, a master diplomat, and a ruthless politician, and he would spend the next 2 decades continuing Richelieu's work of centralizing power and fighting the Habsburgs. His foreign policy was incredibly successful, bringing the long, bloody 30 Years' War to an end with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, a treaty that greatly expanded France's territory and power. But his domestic policies, particularly his new taxes to pay for the war, were deeply unpopular.
He was a foreigner, an Italian, and he lacked the imposing persona of his predecessor. The great nobles, who had been suppressed by Richelieu, saw the regency as a chance to reclaim their old power. It was like a bunch of rebellious teenagers waiting for their intimidating principal to retire before they threw a massive party. This period of instability led to the Fronde, a series of civil wars that raged from 1648 to 1653. The Fronde was a complex conflict, a mix of noble revolts, parliamentary opposition, and popular unrest. The high nobles, who were tired of being marginalized by the king's ministers, rose in rebellion. The magistrates of the Parlement of Paris, a high court, also opposed Mazarin's new taxes and his attempts to bypass their authority.
The people of Paris, who were suffering from high taxes and economic hardship, also took to the streets in protest. The royal family, including the young Louis XIV, was forced to flee the city on several occasions, a humiliating experience that would have a profound impact on the future king. He saw firsthand the dangers of a divided kingdom and a powerful, unruly nobility, and it would shape his entire reign. The Fronde had two distinct phases. The first was the Parliamentary Fronde, which began in 1648 when the Parlement of Paris, the High Court, refused to register a new series of taxes. This was a direct challenge to the king's authority, and it sparked a rebellion in the city. The royal family was forced to flee, and Mazarin, with a combination of cunning and military force, was eventually able to put down the revolt. But the peace did not last. The second phase, the Fronde of the Princes, was a more violent and chaotic conflict that began in 1650. High-ranking nobles, led by Prince Condé, rose in rebellion, seeking to regain their old feudal power and privileges. This was a classic feudal war, with armies fighting each other, but it was also a chaotic mess, with shifting alliances and a lack of clear goals.
Historians still argue whether the Fronde was the last gasp of feudalism or a precursor to the French Revolution, a sign of the deep-seated resentments that were simmering beneath the surface of French society.
Mazarin, with a combination of cunning diplomacy and military force, eventually managed to put down the rebellion. He was a master of political maneuvering, and he skillfully played the factions against each other until they were exhausted. The Fronde was a failure, but it was a crucial turning point. It showed the French people and the French nobility that the only alternative to a strong, centralized monarchy was chaos and civil war. The people, tired of the fighting and instability, were ready for a king who could bring order and peace. The nobility, who had been defeated, were now more willing to accept the king's authority. The Fronde, therefore, was a final bloody spasm of the old feudal order before it finally gave way to a new, more powerful form of government. When Mazarin died in 1661, Louis XIV was 22 years old. Everyone expected him to appoint a new chief minister, a new cardinal to run the kingdom. But Louis XIV had other ideas. He famously announced to his court that he would be his own chief minister, that he would rule alone. This was a radical departure from the previous two reigns. He took complete control of the government, and from that moment on, his reign would be a masterclass in absolute monarchy.
He was a king who believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that his authority came directly from God, and that he was accountable to no one but God. His motto was, "L'État, c'est moi, I am the state," a phrase that perfectly captured his view of his role. His reign would be the culmination of a long, slow process of centralization that had begun with the early Capetians. He had inherited a powerful, centralized state from Richelieu and Mazarin, but he would take it to a new level, creating the most powerful and absolute monarchy in all of Europe.
When Cardinal Mazarin, the man who had ruled France for 2 decades, finally passed away in 1661, everyone in the court, from the highest nobles to the lowliest servants, held their breath. They expected the young king, Louis XIV, to appoint a new chief minister, a new cardinal, to run the kingdom. But Louis XIV, a young man of 22, had other ideas. He famously announced to his court that he would be his own chief minister, that he would rule alone.
This was a radical departure from the previous two reigns, a clear and decisive signal that he was taking complete control of the government. This was the moment when the long, slow, and often messy process of royal centralization, which had begun with the early Capetians, finally came to its magnificent and absolute conclusion. Louis XIV was a monarch who believed deeply in the divine right of kings, the idea that his power came directly from God and that he was accountable to no one but God. His philosophy was encapsulated in his famous motto, L'État, c'est moi, or I am the state. To him, the king and the state were one and the same. He was known as the Sun King, a moniker that perfectly captured his view of himself as the center of the French universe, with all life and power radiating from him. His court was a world of spectacle and ceremony, and he used art, architecture, and ritual to project his power and majesty, turning his very existence into a form of political theater. Louis XIV's most famous and enduring project was the construction of the magnificent Palace of Versailles. It was a massive undertaking, a grand and opulent palace built on what was once his father's humble hunting lodge. Versailles was not just a home for the king, it was a political tool, a gilded cage for the nobility. Louis XIV moved his entire court there, forcing the high nobility to live under his watchful eye. He created a system of elaborate court etiquette and ceremony, where everything from a morning greeting to a dinner with the king was a carefully choreographed ritual. The nobles, who had once been a threat to the monarchy, were now domesticated as courtiers, competing for the king's favor and attention, their power and influence completely dependent on their proximity to the Sun King. It was a brilliant move, a way of neutralizing the aristocracy and turning them into symbols of his power rather than threats to it. He was a king who had learned the hard lessons of the Fronde, and he was not about to let the nobles run wild again. He also continued the work of Richelieu and Mazarin, creating an efficient and professional bureaucracy that was loyal to him. His chief ministers, like Jean-Baptiste Colbert, were commoners who owed their success entirely to the king. Colbert, a financial genius, reformed the country's economy, promoting French industry and trade, and creating a more efficient system of taxation. Louis XIV also created a large, professional army, a tool for both defense and conquest. He fought a series of long and expensive wars, most notably the War of the Spanish Succession, to expand French power and to put his grandson on the throne of Spain. The wars, while often successful, were a huge drain on the country's finances and manpower. Louis XIV's reign was a period of both glory and immense hardship. The arts and sciences flourished under his patronage, and France became the cultural and intellectual capital of Europe. His court was a center of fashion, music, and art, and French became the language of diplomacy and high culture. But this glory came at a cost. The king's wars and his extravagant lifestyle led to massive debts and a heavy burden of taxation on the French people. His religious policies were also a source of conflict. In 1685, he revoked the Edict of Nantes, the very law that had brought an end to the wars of religion. The decision, driven by his desire for religious unity and his intolerance of Protestantism, led to the persecution of the Huguenots, forcing hundreds of thousands of them to flee the country, a huge loss for France's economy and intellectual life.
Historians still argue whether the revocation of the Edict of Nantes was a religious act to assert his absolute power or a political miscalculation that would have a huge negative impact on the kingdom's future.
By the time of Louis XIV's death in 1715, he had transformed France into a powerful, centralized, and absolute monarchy. The medieval feudal order was long gone, and the king was the indisputable ruler of the kingdom. But the seeds of future conflict were already sown. The wars had bankrupted the country. The nobility was now a class of courtiers with no real power, and the common people were groaning under a heavy burden of taxation. His legacy was a mixed one, a France that was powerful and glorious, but also a France that was deeply in debt and on the verge of a profound social and political crisis. The absolute monarchy was at its height, but its long, slow decline was already beginning.
And now, the long winding story of medieval France, with its chaotic beginnings and its long, slow march toward a powerful monarchy, finally fades. The endless tapestry, woven with the ambition of Clovis, the grandeur of Charlemagne, the piety of St. Louis, and the cunning of the Spider King, now draws to a quiet close. As we leave the gilded halls and the polished floors of Versailles, we see the kingdom that has been built on ambition, intrigue, and a relentless quest for power. The whispers of Clovis's baptism, the echoes of Charlemagne's empire, the clang of swords at Crécy, and the fervent prayers of Joan of Arc have all led to this final, magnificent, and yet deeply troubled kingdom. The Sun King's era, for all its splendor, casts a long shadow. The debts incurred by his lavish court and his relentless wars would become a heavy burden, a weight that would press down on his successors and the common people.
The nobility, now stripped of its real power and living as courtiers in a golden cage, had no outlet for their ambition, and the seeds of discontent were beginning to take root. The France that emerges from this long night of history is a powerful nation, but also a fragile one. A kingdom of stark contrasts, where the immense wealth of a few coexists with the crushing poverty of the many.
And so, the story of medieval France, a journey of 1,000 years, comes to an end not with a bang, but with a quiet, fading whisper, leaving behind a kingdom on the verge of a new and unpredictable chapter. The great wheel of history turns, and as we drift off, we are left with the silence, the stillness, and the memory of all that came before.